And Laura, what is important and strategically extremely vital to realize is that this particular ground station was built by the China Great Wall Industry Corporation in collaboration with the People's Liberation Army. So that's where Venezuela actually fits in. Just if you think about operational and technological capacity that space offers.
From the Defense and Aerospace Report, this is The Downlink, a podcast about the intersection of space, the space business, and defense. Not just what's over the horizon, but what's happening above it. I'm your host, Laura Winter. Happy New Year, everyone. It's great to be back after a much-needed holiday break. As you are likely aware, on Saturday, January 3rd, U.S. President Donald Trump ordered U.S. military forces to conduct a large-scale strike across Venezuela's capital city, Caracas. The U.S. Army's elite Delta Force captured Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his wife and flew them out of the country. Now, both of them were arraigned in Manhattan federal court on Monday, January 5th, and they face charges related to narcotics trafficking. Many allies and adversaries are closely watching what is and what is not happening, both within Venezuela's national territory and across Latin America. The focus is on the ground. And so is ours, because the implications for the space domain are strategic. The goals and end state of this U.S. intervention in Venezuela are still fuzzy, despite the U.S. president's stated desire to establish dominance over the nation and its oil reserves. What is coming into focus is the so-called Trump Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. And just to remind everyone, in 1823, almost 203 years ago, President James Monroe declared that North, Central, and South America were located within the United States' sphere of influence. And for the 19th century, the doctrine served as a warning to other imperial powers to stay out. The Trump Corollary, according to the national security strategy and the military operations we have been witnessing since August, seems to be aimed at enforcing the Monroe Doctrine, not only removing unfriendly heads of state, but also kicking out advisors and others representing adversarial nations, such as China, Russia, Iran, and Cuba. In fact, on Friday, 8 hours before Maduro was captured, he was the doting host of Qiu Xiaoqi, China's special representative for Latin American and Caribbean affairs. Just after that meeting, Maduro posted on social media that the two reaffirmed their nation's all-weather strategic partnership. Now, today, the Trump administration is demanding that Venezuela's interim president, Delcy Rodriguez, kick out of the country spies and military personnel from China, Russia, Cuba, and Iran. Okay, so why does all this matter to space? Well, on Venezuelan military bases, China has 2 ground stations that communicate with its space assets, and Russia has 1. And there are a lot more of these ground stations across Latin America. Successive American administrations have claimed that these ground-based space assets would be used to target the United States homeland with nuclear weapons that traverse Earth orbits. To dive more deeply into the strategic implications of these developments, we have Namrata Goswami. But before we get to the interview, there is an update. At the time of this discussion's recording, the U.S. Coast Guard was shadowing a Russian-registered oil tanker known as Marinera. In the days since, the U.S. Coast Guard has seized that vessel. Now here's our conversation. Hello, Nami. Thank you for starting off the year with me. Welcome to 2026.
Thank you, Laura. It's great to be here, and Happy New Year.
Now, we've got a metric ton to discuss, so let's get to introducing yourself to the Downlink audience. Nami, give us the basics on what you do and where you do it.
Sure, Laura. So my name is Namrata Goswami, and I am a professor of space security with the United States Space Force Johns Hopkins University program. I teach space security, space policy, and great power competition. And I'm also the co author of the book Scramble for the Skies, the Great Power Competition to Control the Resources of Outer Space. And I do have to give a disclaimer. Everything I say today is my own personal opinion and does not represent the opinion of the US government, the Department of Defense, the US Air Force, or the US Space Force. Great to be here.
Oh, it's great to have you back on, as always. Now, to begin our discussion, I'm going to attempt to leave to the side some of the thornier legal questions and focus on great power strategy or the lack thereof. But to do that, I need to frame things up a bit. So, everyone, please bear with me. So, the military side of this really kicked off 4 months ago in August when the Trump administration deployed 3 guided missile destroyers near the national waters off the coast of Venezuela. Now, 2 weeks later, on September 2nd, the administration ordered the military to target and destroy a very small ship carrying 11 people. They were accused of transporting illegal narcotics. That's smuggling. That's the controversial strike for those who are keeping score. But since then, there have been a total of 35 known strikes against ships that the U.S. claims were transporting illegal narcotics. Most of these ships are believed to have been sailing in the Caribbean Sea and the Eastern Pacific. It's believed that at least 115 people have been killed in these strikes. Starting last month, that's December, the Coast Guard seized 2 sanctioned oil tankers, the Skipper and the Centuries. The Coast Guard also pursued a 3rd tanker that was once known as the Bella One, but is now known, it's been renamed as the Marinera. It's sailing dark. But since Russia asked the administration to not forcibly board the vessel, the Coast Guard is reportedly shadowing its movements. Now, they're all in the North Atlantic. Now, all of this activity has fallen under the moniker Operation Southern Spear. And if that wasn't interesting enough, Saturday, January 3rd, the administration launched Operation Absolute Resolve. And that was to capture Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro and transport him to New York to face trial for 4 charges related to narcotics, terrorism, and machine guns. His wife, Celia Flores, was also taken, and she may face similar charges. Now, all of these operations are exhibits of the Trump administration's national security strategy, aka the Monroe Doctrine Trump Corollary. So, NAMI, what is this Trump Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, and what is the potential impact to China and Russia's space operations, especially military operations, and their ability to project hard power or deter?
Yeah, sure, Laura. So that's a great question to start with. So when I look at the National Security Strategy 2025, I realize that there are 4 different hemispheres that the strategy focuses on. One is the Western Hemisphere, then you have the Indo-Pacific, the Middle East, and Africa. So in terms of the language and connecting it to great power competition, the one line that really caught my attention was that, for example, with the core Western Hemisphere that the National Security Strategy identifies, it says that the strategy would deny non-hemispheric competitors the ability to position forces or other threatening capabilities or control strategically vital assets. So when I think about this in terms of space power and China-Russia operations, which uses space, this would mean that modern space power that requires ground stations, telemetry, command links, precision navigation, timing, augmentation nodes, as well as downlink pathways, logistics, industrial access, all these are actually coming into play. And in terms of great power competition, what this means is that the willingness to deter and degrade these capacities of countries like China and Russia in this hemisphere would have a direct impact on the second most important area that the national security strategy identifies, which is the Indo-Pacific.
I imagine that this must also pose a pretty serious problem for Latin American governments, right? Many who have close ties with Beijing and Moscow, no?
Yes, it does. Because when you think about For example, China's investments in Latin America under the Belt and Road Initiative, as well as Russia, there has been the development of not just infrastructures related to oil, but also when you think about space that I specialize on, there has been the red flagging of the idea that there are ground stations. For example, China has built a ground station in Argentina called the Espacio Lejano, and which is widely described as being developed by China for its overseas deep space network. But what is more important, and I've said this in interviews earlier, that this has been built by the People's Liberation Army at that time, the Strategic Support Force, today the Aerospace Force. And then again in Venezuela, China has supported, for example, Venezuelan building of satellites, which also creates the potential for the first answer I gave, which is in terms of operational capability, that ground stations help downlink faster, helps precision tracking, and also helps mission support. So, in some sense, this has a deep impact on countries in Latin America as well. And this would also include, for example, regional countries that have aspiration for regional power, like Brazil.
So then where does Venezuela really fit into this mix? What are the Chinese and Russian space assets located in Venezuela? And what benefit does Venezuela get from these relationships?
So, in some sense, that question is the most important question. So, when I look at, for example, Venezuela for the last few decades, it has been a theater of great power competition. So, for example, the inclination of Venezuela's foreign policy has been to establish deeper relations, for example, with countries that the United States sees as peer competitors or countries that it sees as adversarial, for example, China and Russia. And so for Venezuela's, for example, oil industry has a lot of investment from China. And then when it comes to space, how Venezuela fits in is that Russia, for example, planned to open GLONASS ground station by July 2025. Which was cited by, for example, Roscosmos head Bakanov, saying that this particular station, the agreement of which was signed in 2022, but would have become operational by July 2025. And then what is interesting is that there are also the development, for example, of the Capitan Manuel Rio Aerospace Base ground station in partnership with Venezuela's space agency. So you have Russia deeply embedded in that building of, for example, the ability to have faster downlink from their satellites through this particular ground station. And then China, for example, if you look at the open source reporting, China has built Venezuela's ground segment, for example, the El Sombrero ground station, which is adjacent to the Capitan Manuel Rios Air Base.
Oh,
And
no,
which
it's the same place, if I'm not mistaken.
it
It's,
is.
it's
It's
the
actually
same airbase. Yeah.
it's actually that's a great point. It's the same airbase between China and Russia. And Laura, what is important and strategically extremely vital to realize is that this particular ground station was built by the China Great Wall Industry Corporation in collaboration with the People's Liberation Army. So that's where Venezuela actually fits in. Just if you think about operational and technological capacity that space offers, which we can draw out later in terms of what it means, for example, for Indo-Pacific operation. More importantly, I'll end with this, that Venezuela formally joined China's International Lunar Research Station initiative in July 2023, which is the initiative that China has established in 2021 to build a China-led international lunar order. And so Venezuela not only has collaboration with China for low Earth orbit data linkage, uplink and downlink, and enabling faster processing, for example, of if you think about operational battlefield management for China, but also in terms of its lunar capacity.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And I think it should also be noted that, at least to my knowledge, so it could be limited. So forgive me if I'm coming up a little short here, but my understanding is that China has manufactured and launched all of Venezuela's satellites since 2008, starting when the country was under Hugo Chavez, right? So 2008, there was the Venesat 1 communication satellite, which is named the Simon Bolivar.
Yes.
2012, VRSS 1 remote sensing craft, and it's got an interesting name as well, of Francisco de Miranda. And in 2017, the VRSS 2, called the Antonio José de Sucre, for inspection of land resources, environmental protection, and prevention of seismic movement. So that's a relationship. That's a technology relationship. That's an economic relationship. And that's actually also a public security relationship, if you think about it, when you think about environmental protection and seismic stuff, right? I want to know then, more generally speaking, in Latin America, what kind of space assets do China and Russia operate or have access to in Latin America? Because that is the whole sort of Monroe Doctrine, Trump Corollary kind of thing. And people seem to forget that Latin America is a part of the Indo-Pacific, because it's the Eastern Pacific. What are their use cases that these space assets have that are located in Latin America?
So there could be several uses. For example, let's take a scenario in the Pacific, right? So if you think about the ground stations that China has built in Latin America, that could enable, for example, if you have, say, an operation in the Pacific, this would mean that China would be able to have better latency, resilience of its satellite downlink capability. Second, the most important thing, for example, in terms of hard power projection, which we touched in your first question, is that if you think about China's informationized warfare, as they point out, which includes artificial intelligence, space, and also psychological operations. Space plays a very vital role, and ground stations play a critical role, for example, in sensing, targeting, communicating, navigating, as well as I mentioned before, battle damage assessment, right? So in some sense, that's where Latin America's ground stations become extremely vital. So, for example, if you think about China's ground based space infrastructure, this is becoming a very critical part of, for example, President Xi Jinping's military reform that talked about joint operations that would include informatized operations, which includes satellites. And then finally, I'll say that the most important thing is that when you think about how this affects operations in the Pacific, say, for example, if we take a scenario like Taiwan, the most important thing that is of extreme value in the Pacific scenario is the amount of time you need to assess real-time movement of, say, carrier strike groups, submarines under the surface, mobile air defenses, missile launchers. Now, if you have delay in that kind of data downlink and the assessment of the battle, which you depend on, for example, on your ground stations around the world, that can have a deep impact on your deterrence that you are forecasting, both China and Russia in their theaters, and as well as their ability to respond to, say, for example, a U.S. Counter response to, say, a Chinese escalation in Taiwan or the Indo-Pacific. So there are very deep operational impacts in this regard.
Now, before we get too much further along, I do want to point out to the audience here that there are quite a few ground stations that China has and countries, right? China has ground stations in Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Peru, and as we were just talking about, Venezuela. But Russia also has quite a few as well. Russia has ground stations for the GLONASS constellation, which is kind of like GPS, but they run it, right? They've got 4 stations in Brazil, 1 in Nicaragua, and 1 in Venezuela. There are agreements for Argentina and Mexico, though I'm not really quite sure what the status is of those particular ground stations. But just to refocus back on China real quick, because they've kind of seen some of this coming in the tea leaves, right? China's not been deaf and dumb and blind to the fact that it is vulnerable to geopolitical developments, such as the Trump Corollary or what's happening in Venezuela. So, how is China vulnerable and how is China addressing that vulnerability? Because if they lose access to that ground station in Argentina, they might get a black eye, but they may not be completely down and out.
Yeah, so if you think about the vulnerability of China, for example, when we think about it in terms of power projection, right? So, as we discussed in the podcast earlier, hard power projection depends on, for example, space assets to project military power, to understand your real time tracking, command and control, and precision navigation timing. And ground stations come into play, as you mentioned, the ground station in Chile or Argentina or even in Venezuela, right? So, in some sense, if you think about what is happening currently with the Western Hemisphere focused by the United States, where it has clearly stated in its national security strategy that it would not allow an adversarial nation to build capacity that could undermine U.S. ability, not just to protect its homeland, but also to achieve success, say, in the Indo-Pacific, right? So the vulnerability that China faces is that in the Western Hemisphere, China has built relationship, for example, with host nations, depending on the particular leader in power. Argentina is a case of that. Venezuela is a case of that historically. So the vulnerability is that if there is leadership turnover, that those particular agreements might not be continued. For example, in Argentina, we see this. The earlier regime signed a lease with China where the Argentinian ground station is absolutely controlled as per contract by China's People's Liberation Army with little ability for Argentina's government to intervene. And that's part of the contract. So while China argues that this is for deep space network, for example, that it supports some of its deep space missions, like, say, its Chang'e 4 mission, there are concerns that this particular ground station might also achieve military operational effects. And so that's one, that the host nation turnover of political leadership is a vulnerability. The second thing, which is extremely important, is that if then nations sign leases with China that allows China to build ground station but does not enable China for full political control, and they can actually cut off the switch if there is an issue or if the US brings that pressure. So that vulnerability also is there, that while China will have some of its own domestic ground stations, for example, for low Earth orbit downlink purposes, that is extremely vital, it might not have that overall coverage. Now, how has China tried to address this? So one of the most important strategic argument that has been made in open source conversation is that China has built a relay satellite low Earth orbit constellations called Tianlian, which is a data relay satellite specifically argued by China's People's Liberation Army, Aerospace Force, and others as critical enablers that actually can connect directly through relay satellite capability to ground stations, for example, in China. So that means that is not vulnerable to, say, ground stations in Latin America or South America. But while that could be something that China can argue that they already have as a capacity, there are certain limitations for relay satellites. One is that you still should have the ability to send your data to ground stations on Earth. And so
directly, because this is a line of sight issue,
yes,
right? Because
yes,
the Earth turns, and if
exactly.
you want to talk to the moon, well, they're already going through a relay in Lagrange point 2 to reach their stuff, their systems that are on the moon, because it's on the far side. So they're already going through a relay station. But if they lose a ground station or access to a ground station, then they will lose a line of sight communication with Lagrange point 2, which is where that relay satellite, communication satellite is located. I think it's called Chichao, and Chichao 1 and Chichao 2. And it just makes things a bit more, probably a lot more complicated. And then there's also latency.
And as well as you mentioned, right? So for example, for the Chang'e 4 mission that use Magpie Bridge 1 and 2 that you mentioned, the relay satellites in Lagrange point 2 and then in the elliptical orbit around the moon, they still needed to use a ground station for communication and for downlink purposes, right? So, which means that while you might have relay satellite constellations in low Earth orbit, that is an ability to do targeting or communication and control capability and command signals as well, you will still need ground stations that are not just in your domestic setting but outside. And so that while it enables some level of the ability to have capacity that is not totally redundant or destroyed, it still limits the real time targeting, sensing, understanding of the battlefield, for example, in the Pacific. So that's number one. Number two is that there are also, as you mentioned, latency, but also relay networks have their own limitation. So, for example, they would not have the infinite or the larger capacity that the ground station might have. And then ground diversity is extremely vital because it kind of reduces the choke points or the troubleshooters that might occur, for example, in China's conception of joint operation, that it would require that kind of near real-time data management. So while relay satellites help, they cannot replace ground stations, in my perspective.
So essentially, the ground stations that they have built and or lease access to, this is a real vulnerability to the Trump corollary. And Trump has said that the U.S. government does intend to put pressure on Latin American governments to bend the knee, essentially, and do their will and do their bidding according to the Monroe Doctrine, right?
Yeah, so for the longest time, US strategic thinkers and those who follow national security have been pointing out that if, on one hand, the US is treaty bound to come to the rescue of, say, Taiwan, which, by the way, the national security strategy also mentions that there can be no unilateral change of status quo, right? So the question operationally that has been thought through in testimony before Congress, as well as strategic conversation, is that what about the Chinese space infrastructures that are across Latin America that, while China argues is for peaceful purposes, are mostly maintained by the People's Liberation Army, right? So in the context, to answer your question, this particular Trump corollary of the Monroe Doctrine does put pressure on Latin American countries in terms of thinking through their hedging posture, right? That they can have deep economic ties with China through the Belt and Road Initiative, sign contracts, for example, to build ground stations or space infrastructure that could end up having dual capacity. Because, Laura, the moment you are going to use any kind of satellite downlink capacity for command and control or telemetry, that results in the concern that this could be used for military operations, say, for example, by China against the US and its allies in the second region that the national security strategy identifies as vital, which is the Indo-Pacific. So this particular Trump corollary would give Latin American countries a pause to think through whether their hedging posture, by which I would mean economic ties with China, very selective ties, for example, as we see with Russia, where it's building its capacity, and security ties with the United States, can they do all that without some level of consequence? So this raises lots of strategic questions, both operationally but also politically.
And economically, I mean,
Yeah.
because if these Latin American capitals are forced to choose between recalibrating their ties with China and Russia, and we know at least how China feels about that kind of stuff because they've punished other countries that have tried to recalibrate. But then on the flip side, they could face a Monroe Doctrine enforcement by the United States. And we're kind of seeing that happen a bit right now. And that's kind of a scary thought right there, right? So, lastly, how does all of this support or not support U.S. national defense?
So That's a broader question to tackle, right? So
It's not an easy one, I
it's not an
know.
easy one, right? So if you think about national defense, one of the, and if I can touch on my own expertise in terms of great power competition and the geopolitical situation we have, where not just in space, but in other technology sectors, China is clearly, in terms of its foreign policy and signaling under President Xi Jinping, wants to establish an international order that is dominated by China, right? And so, in terms of national defense, what I would see is that the US is going to become much more assertive in terms of what adversarial nations, which it deems as a competitor and a nation that is trying to undermine US national security and international standing, would have very limited capacity to build hardcore infrastructure that could have civilian and military implications in its sphere of influence. For now, the national security strategy has made it very clear that that is the Western Hemisphere, the number one region, right? And then the second important question in terms of national defense. So when you think about US foreign policy priority in terms of national defense, that is to ensure that the Indo Pacific, especially the sea lanes of communication, the South China Sea, the Malacca Strait remains free, because the argument given in the 2025 national security strategy is that US prosperity and the ability of the United States to thrive depends on the Indo Pacific remaining free. So there is a direct connection of the Indo Pacific's economic viability and the United States' ability to do the same. So, in some sense, those two are clearly connected. The ability to ensure that the Western Hemisphere remains accessible to the United States and that nations there are not intentionally enabling a peer competitor to establish infrastructure that can be used for military operations, say, for example, against US treaty commitments in the Indo-Pacific. So I see a direct connection to US national defense there. So national defense for the United States, in my mind, does not just include United States territory, but also the obligation that the United States has through treaty, for example, to Japan in the Pacific.
Nami, we've run out of time. I want to thank you so much for making the time to come back on the Downlink podcast.
Thank you, Laura, for having me.
That's it for this week. For your daily dose of award-winning defense coverage, listen to the Defense and Aerospace Report with Vago Muradian. And for the maritime domain, listen to Cavis Ships with Chris Cavis and Chris Cervello. And get your air domain news and analysis from the Air Power Podcast with JJ Gertler and Vago Muradian. I'm Laura Winter. Thank you for listening.